On behalf of the Coaches Association of Ontario, welcome coaches and sport leaders. Thank you for joining us for this important concussion management update. As will be outlined by our expert lineup of speakers, today's session will focus on key updates in the return to sport protocols that the designated persons under Rowan's law regulations need to know and used to help implement on the field, on the ice, on the floor, at the track, and in the water. We would like to begin by acknowledging the land upon which we are grateful to be presenting from today. The land the CAO calls home is the traditional territory of many nations, including Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississauga of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. Please note that the information provided in this presentation is not legal advice. It is provided for informational purposes only. Stakeholders should seek independent legal advice to understand their legal obligations. For those attending today's session live, you are eligible for one non-MCCP PD point towards your maintenance of certification in the National Coaching Certification Program. The link to provide your number will be available in the chat throughout the presentation. If you require technical assistance, please use the chat to contact the hosts. There will be a Q&A at the end of the session, so please populate any questions you may have as they come up throughout the session using the Q&A bot. With housekeeping out of the way, I am pleased to hand it over to our MC for the presentation, Stephanie Cowell. Stephanie has spent more than a decade working in the area of injury and trauma prevention. She's the Director of Knowledge Translation, leading the analysis and synthesis of research to develop the organization's evidence-based solutions that advocate. Stephanie's experience includes working with government, health, sport, and education stakeholders at national and provincial levels. She led the publication of Canada's first guideline on concussion in sport. Please welcome Stephanie Cowell.
Thank you so much, Mercedes, and a huge thank you to the Coaches Association of Ontario for bringing us together for this session. I want to provide some background for you on why this session is so important. We can go to the next slide. In 2023 and 2024, Canada's concussion guidelines were updated, including the Clinical Practice Guidelines for Health Professionals and Parachute's Canadian Guideline on Concussion in Sport. These guidelines are informed by the latest consensus statement on concussion in sport and adapted specifically to the Canadian health and sport context. They provide guidance so that we have a consistent, harmonized approach to concussion safety across the country. And as concussion research evolves, it's critically important that we evolve with it to protect the health and well-being of athletes as they engage in all of the amazing benefits of sport and physical activity. When we know better, we do better. In Ontario, we have a vehicle to do this through Rowan's Law. Next slide, please. And so we were so pleased to hear from the Government of Ontario when on Rowan's Law Day 2024, they announced funding support to the Coaches Association of Ontario and Parachute to help ensure coaches, athletes, parents, and volunteers have access to the latest resources and protocol templates, concussion information. In addition to this informative session, this work means that everyone in Ontario will be able to find an up-to-date coaches toolkit on coachesontario.ca and oareness resources and protocols at ontario.ca/concussions. And we also want to acknowledge our partners at Ophea who are leading similar important work to support concussion safety in school-based sport and physical activity. In this session, you will hear about what is new to help inform your role as you continue doing your very best to protect young brains. And you'll also hear firsthand on why not doing better is not an option. This brings us to our first speaker of the session, Jen Kish. Jen dedicated 13 years to representing Canada on the international stage, including leading Canada's women's sevens team to a bronze medal at the 2016 Rio Olympics. Jen endured 5 concussions during her professional rugby career, and the consequences of playing through her injuries ultimately led to her retirement in 2018 and subsequent advocacy for mental health awareness. Jen is contributing to concussion research by donating her brain to the Canadian Concussion Centre, aiming to raise awareness and promote safety in sports for future generations, particularly focusing on the unique risks faced by women athletes. Jen has been inducted into the Edmonton Hall of Fame and the Rugby Canada Hall of Fame. Welcome, Jen. Thanks for being with us. Over to you.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here whenever I get the opportunity to discuss brain health and brain management, concussions, etc. I'm always really excited to be a part of that because it's really, really important. So my connection to concussions is a deeply personal one. It's shaped by my experiences on the rugby field over the past 13 years. As someone who has played at the highest level, I've given and received my fair share of hard hits. I'd say it's almost a rite of passage in sport, isn't it? While I've always prided myself on my resilience, I grossly underestimated the risks I was taking by ignoring, rushing back, and even hiding my head injuries throughout my career. I truly believed that toughness meant pushing through pain, especially the type of pain that couldn't be seen by those around me. Um, it wasn't until I retired that I truly began to feel the lingering effects of the head injuries I sustained throughout my career. At first, I would brush off the occasional headache as just another part of life, a minor inconvenience that came with the territory of being active and competitive. However, as time went on, those headaches became more frequent and much harder to ignore. Um, along then came, a thick cognitive fog that clouded my thoughts and made simple tasks feel overwhelming. I found myself struggling to concentrate, and my once sharp memory felt very dull. It was during these quiet moments of reflection that I started to question whether my approach to handling injuries, especially head injuries, was genuinely wise. Was the thrill of pushing my limits worth the cost of my long-term health? That was the big question for me. In October of 2024, I decided to get a brain scan to assess the state of my brain. I was hoping for some peace of mind. But what I discovered, however, was quite alarming. The results revealed that my brain appeared to be aging at a rate far beyond my years. I'm 36. So it was resembling that of an 85-year-old. The presence of numerous white dots on the scan was particularly scary to see, as they indicated areas of concerns that shouldn't have been there, especially at my age. So my brain scan looks similar to those who have MS. And that was a reality that hit me really hard. It's a strange phenomenon, really. In the heat of a game, a split second can turn into a lifetime of consequences. Those moments of losing consciousness, even just for a couple seconds, can be deceptive. Sometimes I would find myself back on my feet before I even had the chance to process what had happened, brushing off the impact as if it were just another tackle. Now, I'm about to show you guys one of those tackles. And before you see it, just know that this tackle was the result of 2 herniated discs in my neck, a tear, and a massive concussion. So if you could just show them the slide, please. So Let's see it about a couple more times so you guys can get the reality of what it is I'm talking about. So I was pile drived into the ground. And I vividly remember this particular tackle during the game. It was one of those moments where I felt the bones literally in my neck crunch, and my vision momentarily went dark. A surge of adrenaline then rushed through my body, allowing me to bounce right back up despite the pain that I was in. Honestly, I was in shock. And when you're in shock, you could do some pretty crazy things. This transpired just 2 minutes before halftime, and I was trailing behind the play by approximately 30 feet by that time. I got back to my feet. Despite experiencing the extreme pain, I continued to push through until the final whistle blew, signaling the end of the first half. At that point, I was removed from the game for a medical assessment. Although I had landed on my head and briefly lost consciousness, and as you saw in that video, it kind of went limp for a second, I successfully passed the standard concussion assessment protocol. I gotta say, concussion protocols, while essential, are not foolproof. They often rely on the subjective assessments of the athlete, who may feel pressured to minimize their symptoms to return to the field. And that's what I did all the time. We all know that concussion protocols are designed to assess an athlete's cognitive function and symptomology, but these assessments can sometimes overlook the potential for lingering effects that may not manifest immediately. Fortunately, in this situation, I physically could not move my neck, and it was a limitation that turned out to be a pivotal blessing in disguise. Um, the hard truth is, I gambled with my life one too many times, and looking back, I can unequivocally state that I should never have been in the driver's seat when it came to making decisions about my return to play. This is why it's imperative that coaches and medical staff prioritize the long-term health and safety of players over the short-term goals of winning. The decision to allow an athlete to return to play should never rest solely on the athlete's desire to compete or the pressure to win. For instance, if an athlete takes a hard fall and lands on their head like I did, claiming they feel fine and have no concussion symptoms, I urge coaches to take a step back and wait. It's crucial to observe and monitor the athlete closely before allowing them back on the field, because symptoms can sometimes take time to surface, and rushing back can lead to devastating effects that go far beyond the immediate moment. And when I played, there was sideline assessments that you could do where you get pulled, for a couple seconds, you answer a bunch of questions, you do a balance test, and then they send you back in. And that was, when I was playing. It's obviously very different now, and I'm grateful for that. As we look towards the future of sports, like, the commitment of athlete safety should be a non-negotiable standard in sports. Coaches are not just responsible for training techniques and game strategies. They are also the frontline advocates for athlete health and safety. I think it would be great to see a cultural shift where open dialogue about mental and physical health becomes the norm within sports. Athletes should feel empowered to speak up about their experiences and concerns regarding concussions, knowing that their coaches will listen and act in their best interest. I think by fostering a community that values education and transparency, we can create a safer environment for future athletes and current athletes. And I think by fostering a community that values education and transparency, allows, you know, a window, like I said, like a normalcy towards, you know, athletes' health, brain health. Yeah, I truly do envision a future where every coach is not only a strategist, but also an advocate for their players, their health, leading the charge and following the strict guidelines when it comes to an athlete returning to play, no matter how important the game is. Um, I wish, you know, there's a lot of things that I wish I could go back and redo. But experiencing what I've experienced and the lessons that I've learned, I think it's really important that coaches, athletes, medical staff really take my story to heart, because the consequences of my choices are, I'm paying for it. I'm paying for it. And I have, you know, a 8-month-old daughter. And my biggest fear is not knowing who she is when she's 20, because I've, you know, played through concussions and I should have never done that. So yeah, I appreciate everybody taking the time to listen to my story. It's you know, we contact sports, there's always a risk in uh getting concussions, but I think we can proceed safely in contact sports by, you know, managing brain health properly and really looking out for the athlete, as they continue to play. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jen. That was amazing. I'm sure others agree with me that you say thank you for listening, but I think I could sit here and listen to you go on for a lot longer. So glad you're here to so eloquently share your story, but also your hopes for the future. And you bring such an important perspective. You've been there, you know, at the height of heights in sport. And so for you to share this message with young athletes, with coaches, sport administrators is just so impactful. It's an important voice to have. So thank you. And glad that you have many exciting things going in life right now, like enjoying your little one, and lots of positives to focus on. But also just, you know, thanks for being such a great advocate.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Laura Purcell. Dr. Purcell is a pediatric sport medicine physician at Grand River Sport Medicine Center in Cambridge, Ontario. She's also Associate Clinical Professor in the Department of Pediatrics at McMaster University. She is a member of the Concussion in Sport group and has been involved in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th International Consensus Conferences on Concussion in Sport as an expert panelist, presenter, and systematic review co-author. Dr. Purcell has authored or co-authored more than 30 peer-reviewed articles, more than 15 position statements and guidelines, and written or co-written more than 20 book chapters. So to say the least, Dr. Laura Purcell brings a lot of incredible experience and expertise to us, and just a great example of the expertise we're lucky to have in Canada. Thank you, Dr. Purcell, and over to you to tell us more about what's new in concussion science.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for that kind introduction. And thank you for the Coaches Association of Ontario for inviting me to be here today and for organizing this event. I also want to thank Jen for a powerful story of personal experience with concussion, which helps put in perspective why we're having these events. So my role today is to answer the question as to why we have consensus statements and why we have updates to the way that we manage concussion. Next slide, please. So the reason that this is so important is that concussions are common injuries in sport, as Jen so powerfully illustrated. This is data from the Public Health Agency of Canada, which indicates that the majority of concussions in sport occur in the pediatric age group, with a peak incidence of in the 10 to 14-year age group. And this roughly translates to about 450 concussions per 100,000 persons in Canada. Next slide, please. Which translates into thousands and thousands of athletes visiting emergency departments in Canada every year being diagnosed with concussions. Not all athletes go to the emergency departments for medical care, however. Lots of athletes go to their family doctors or to walk-in clinics, which don't have injury surveillance systems in place. And we know, unfortunately, that a number of athletes do not seek medical care at all. And so those numbers are lost altogether. So we know that the current estimates of concussion incidents are likely grossly underestimated. We do know that particularly in the youth age group, that about half of all concussions in this age group occur in sports, particularly in collision and contact sports such as ice hockey, rugby, and ringette. And we know from Jen's experience in rugby that this is certainly the case. Next slide, please. So why is concussion management so important, and why are events like this so important? The reality is that if concussions are not recognized and managed appropriately, there is a high risk of catastrophic brain injury, which can lead to death. And unfortunately, that is what occurred with Rowan Stringer. So Rowan was also a rugby player and was playing in high school with concussion symptoms that had not been diagnosed, and unfortunately sustained another brain injury, which led to catastrophic brain swelling and her death. We know also that, given the data that I just presented from the Public Health Agency of Canada, the majority of sport-related concussions occur in athletes who are attending school. And we know that the effects of concussion can negatively impact their ability to learn and potentially could impact their future potential. Injured athletes have impaired performance, and that can also increase their injury risk, leading to more severe brain injury or injuries in other body parts. Concussions that are not managed appropriately can lead to symptoms persisting for weeks to months after the injury and can potentially cause chronic neurological and psychological sequelae. So it's really important that concussions are recognized and managed appropriately. Next slide, please. So over the last 2 decades, there's been increasing recognition and awareness in both the medical field and sporting organizations of the importance of recognizing concussions and making sure that athletes who have sustained concussions are managed appropriately. So the International Olympic Committee, the International Ice Hockey Federation, and FIFA organized the first symposium on concussion in sport in Vienna in 2001. They brought together concussion experts from around the world and had the first international conversation about concussion in sport and how important it was to manage these injuries properly. That first conference was followed by the second International Concussion in Sport Conference held in Prague in 2004. Next slide, please. Following the initial symposium and the second international conference, summary and agreement statements were published, which summarized the information that had been presented at those conferences and helped form the initial guidelines about how concussions in sport should be recognized and managed. Dr. Karen Johnson and Dr. Winna Miwesa are both Canadian physicians who were two of the leading experts in these early conferences and really paved the way for future conferences and the guidelines that we currently follow for concussion management. Next slide, please. Prior to the third international conference that was held in Zurich in 2008, it was decided by the organizing committee to adopt a consensus format based on the National Institutes of Health guidelines, which means essentially that prior to the conference, a series of scientific questions were posed that helped direct the content of the conference. Following the conference itself, an expert panel was convened over 2 days and discussed what the current evidence was for concussion management, and developed the most current consensus statement at that time. This format was also adopted for the Zurich 2012 conference, or the fourth International Consensus Conference, which led to, next slide, please, the publication of the third consensus document, and then the fourth consensus document. The British Journal of Sport Medicine at this time became the main dissemination instrument that was used to ensure that the consensus guidelines were disseminated as broadly and widely as possible, so that healthcare practitioners from around the world had access to the most current recommendations. Next slide, please. In preparation for the 5th International Consensus Conference in Berlin in 2016, there was an additional step taken. So the scientific questions that were posed that helped guide the content of the conference were actually decided to be turned into systematic reviews. And author groups were organized around each topic and produced a systematic review where they reviewed all the current literature at that time and summarized it into a published document that accompanied the consensus document. Next slide, please. So for the first time, the consensus document was actually published with 12 systematic reviews, which summarized all the evidence that was currently available at that time. Next slide, please. The 6th International Consensus Conference was scheduled to be held in Paris in 2020, but as you may recall, there was a COVID pandemic in 2020, which plunged the world into chaos and forced the postponement of the 6th International Consensus Conference to 2022, which took place in Amsterdam. Next slide, please. So the most current guidelines that we use for concussion were published in the British Journal of Sport Medicine in June of 2023. In addition to the consensus statement, which was again developed by an expert panel, there were 10 systematic reviews published, which summarized all of the evidence about concussion management available at that time. There were also a number of editorials and new concussion assessment tools that were published in 2 journals of the British Journal of Sport Medicine. Next slide, please. So you may be wondering why do we have all of these documents being updated and changed every 4 years or so? Next slide, please. The main reason for that is that over the last 2 decades, concussion has become a very hot research topic, and the number of journal articles has exploded, particularly in the last decade, with hundreds and hundreds of new documents being published every year. In preparation for the Amsterdam conference in 2022, more than 78,000 citations were reviewed or were screened for the systematic reviews, and almost 1,500 full text reviews were completed in order to write the systematic reviews. So as you can imagine, that is a lot of time and resource intense work. And there are a lot of documents that have to be reviewed in order to make sure that we are on top of all the evidence that is available. So the reason for the documents being updated every 4 years and the conferences being updated every 4 years are twofold. So first, the amount of research is really exploding, and we have a lot more data available. But part of the consensus process is identifying the gaps in our knowledge and trying to fill those gaps by identifying where the research needs to be targeted. So after each consensus conference, the consensus statements have identified where the gaps are and have encouraged researchers to try to fill those gaps. And so it takes time for research to be done. From the point of conception of the idea through implementation to the publication of results, it can take months to years. So it does take time for that information to be made available. And so it was deemed appropriate to have the conferences every 4 years to allow substantial information to be presented so that we can actually make evidence-informed decisions and recommendations for concussion management. Next slide, please. So in the most recent document, it was organized under the 13 R's of sport-related concussion to help organize the discussion. As a coach, the most important ones for you are being able to recognize when a concussion has happened and be able to remove an athlete who is suspected to have a concussion. Knowing what the return to sport protocol is also important so that you can help guide the athlete safely back into the sporting venue. As well, being able to recognize when you as a coach can help reduce and prevent recurrent concussion injuries to protect your athletes. Next slide, please. So as a coach, you play an important role in the circle of care for an injured athlete. In addition to their parents, teachers, teammates, friends and family, and the healthcare professionals, you as a coach are very important in the support of the athlete as they recover from their concussion and helping them get back into the sporting role and environment in a safe and protected way. Next slide, please. So the first important thing is to make sure that you understand what a concussion is and be able to recognize it. So as Jen alluded to, it can be difficult to make that assessment, particularly when things happen quickly in a sporting environment. But knowing what a concussion is and what the signs and symptoms are can help make that determination. So I'll ask Mercedes to play the video.
The type of traumatic brain injury, or TBI, caused by a bump, blow, or jolt to the head, or by a hit to the body that causes your head and brain to move rapidly back and forth. This sudden movement can literally cause the brain to bounce around or twist in the skull, stretching and damaging the brain cells and creating chemical changes in the brain. What you might not know is that these chemical changes make the brain more sensitive to any increased stress or injury until it fully recovers.
Next slide, please. So as a coach, you are on the front lines and are in a position where you are likely the first person to interact with an injured athlete. So part of the consensus process was developing assessment tools that can be used to help with that process. So the concussion recognition tool, the version 6, is now the most current tool that has been developed, particularly for non-medically trained stakeholders in the sporting environment. So coaches, athletes, parents, referees, other officials, volunteers, anyone who is not medically trained but is involved in sport should be aware of the concussion recognition tool to help you recognize when a potential concussion may have occurred. In the concussion recognition tool, there is a red flag section, which indicates signs and symptoms that may indicate a very severe injury. So if a athlete is complaining of neck pain or tenderness, as Jen was in the video that she shared with us, if there is a prolonged level loss of consciousness, so more than a few seconds, if an athlete is repeatedly vomiting, those are what we call red flag signs that may indicate there's a more severe injury. And these should prompt you to initiate your emergency action plan to safely transport these athletes to medical care as quickly as possible. For most concussions, they do not have red flag symptoms. So you need to be aware of the signs and symptoms of a suspected concussion. So if an athlete has been injured, so they've had a hit to the face or the neck, face or head, or a blow to the body that may have transferred a force to the brain, they may start to exhibit signs like being unsteady on their feet, having a dazed or glazed look to their eyes, not remembering where they are. They may complain of headache, neck pain, feeling sick to their stomach, They may be more emotional, or they may have difficulty concentrating or remembering things. If you have an athlete who is injured, who displays any of these signs, you should suspect a concussion and remove them from play. Next slide, please. So it's really important that you do not allow an injured athlete to go back if you have any suspicion of a concussion. So if in doubt, sit them out. And as Jen so eloquently stated, you can't necessarily rely on the athlete to be able to report how they're feeling. They may not be aware that they are not feeling right. So you can't rely on them to necessarily say, I feel fine, I don't have any symptoms. If you have a suspicion, it is far better to err on the side of caution and hold them out rather than letting them go back in. And as Jen also alluded to, sometimes symptoms don't occur right at the time of the injury, or they may resolve very quickly and then come back later on. So it's really important, if you have any suspicion, to not let them go back to play. When you take them out of play, it's important that you don't leave them alone. You should have them accompanied by a responsible adult who can keep an eye on them and make sure they don't get worse with time. For younger athletes, you should be contacting parents to let them know that the injury has occurred, and you should be advising the athlete and a responsible caregiver that they should be medically assessed to determine if they've had a concussion or not. And they shouldn't be going back to play until they've been medically cleared to go back to play. Next slide, please. It's also important to recognize that in younger children, they may not complain of the same symptoms as older athletes. So younger children in particular may complain more of a tummy ache rather than saying they feel sick to their stomach or even with a headache. They may have more behavioral changes, so being very crying more often, or being very clingy, or just acting differently than they normally do. So it's important to have a high index of suspicion, particularly if an injury is unwitnessed. In the younger age group, they may not be able to tell you that they've been injured. They may not be able to relay the incidents that led to how they're feeling. So you just want to have a high index of suspicion that potentially an injury has occurred. Next slide, please. So one of the big changes with the 6th International Consensus Statement is the role of rest and exercise in the recovery from concussion. So the current recommendations are for athletes to have a relative rest for the first 24 to 48 hours, meaning that they can continue to do some light physical and cognitive activity as long as it's not exacerbating symptoms. So we don't want athletes lying in bed in a dark room for days at a time. What we know is that prolonged rest can actually make recovery worse. So it can make symptoms worse and can prolong recovery. So we don't want them cocooning anymore. We also have a lot of evidence now that exercise as a treatment for recovery of concussion is beneficial, particularly in the early part of the recovery period. There is evidence that exercise safely can actually prevent persisting symptoms and can help the recovery process. Next slide, please. And that is one of the key reasons why the return to sport strategy has been modified from the original strategy that was put forward several years ago. So the return to sport strategy is still a 6-step process, but it's now divided into 2 halves. So the first half, or steps 1, 2, and 3, are part of the recovery process. So athletes who are still symptomatic can still progress through steps 1, 2, and 3, as long as their symptoms do not get worse by more than 1 or 2 points out of 10, and as long as their symptoms recover within an hour of stopping activity. Each of these steps should take a minimum of 24 hours, but they can be as long as it takes for the athlete to fully recover. For an athlete to progress from step 3, which is sport-specific activity, to step 4, which is a non-contact training drill, Symptoms must be completely resolved at both rest and with activity, and athletes should be fully back to a symptom-free state. So if they are still having symptoms, they should not progress to stage 4. Medical clearance ideally should happen between steps 3 and 4 to make sure that the athletes are completely symptom-free before they start progressing their activity, but it can occur at any point between steps 4 and 5. The really important part is that this return to sport strategy should be supervised by a healthcare practitioner. We do not expect coaches to be making the decisions for when athletes move from one step to the next. And it's important for athletes in the first part between steps 1 and 3 to recognize that they should not be pushing through symptoms if they are worse, if they are exacerbated more than 2 points out of 10, or if their symptoms are lasting longer than an hour after they stop activity. In steps 4 through 6, if symptoms come back, then the athlete should stop progressing at that point and should go back to their healthcare practitioner to be reevaluated to make sure that no other interventions need to occur, and make sure that they are safe going back to the return to sport protocol. And it's really important that if an athlete has been injured, they should not go back to play that day to prevent more serious injury. Next slide, please. So part of the recovery process from a concussion is obviously return to sport for an athlete. And for many athletes, sport is quite important to their lives and to their identity. So keeping in touch with their sporting environments, with their teammates, with their peer support group is really important. So even if athletes are not ready to be practicing with the team, we do encourage them to attend practices so that they can be part of the sport environment and still be part of the team, but without putting themselves at risk of re-injury. As athletes are getting back into the stages of return to sport, as a coach, you can help protect them by clearly labeling them in some way that they are still recovering. So having a different color penny on, or a penny, like a patch or something that says don't hit or stop, that clearly indicates they're still recovering from injury, can help protect them from incidental impact or contact. As a coach, it's really important that you touch base with your athlete to see how they are doing with the progression through the return to sport protocol, to make sure that if they are having any symptoms, that you don't allow them to progress further, and to keep an eye on obvious signs that may indicate that they're not quite ready. So if they're slowing down in practice, if they're stopping to have a rest, if they're grabbing their head, those are signs that potentially they are not symptom-free and that they may need to go back to their healthcare practitioner to be reevaluated. It's really important that as a coach, you get a letter from the healthcare practitioner stating that the athlete is ready to go back. So to make sure that they have medical supervision and medical clearance to go back so that they are going back safely. Next slide, please. As you know, sports is only one part of an athlete's life. They have other aspects of their life, including work and school. And for student athletes in particular, school is an incredibly important part of their life. Concussions can negatively impact their ability to attend school. One aspect of recovery is making sure that they get back into the classroom as quickly and as safely as possible. So the Concussion and Sport Group has developed the Return to Learn guideline that can help athletes who need help getting back into the classroom. Not all athletes will require going through this strategy, but it's there for those who do. The Return to Learn strategy is much more fluid and is more individually directed by the athlete themselves, and is accompanied by potentially schedule modifications or classroom accommodations so that athletes are can be back in the classroom, but can still manage their symptoms while they are there. As a coach, it's important to realize that the return to learn and return to sport strategies can occur in tandem. So as the student is getting back into the classroom, they can start the return to sport protocol. But the important thing to know is that students should be fully back into the classroom without requiring any modifications or accommodations before they fully get back into sport. So if an athlete is still having difficulty in school, they're still requiring modifications or accommodations, they should not be progressing beyond step 3 of the return to sport protocol, because that indicates they are not symptom-free. So if an athlete is telling you that they are ready to go to non-contact practice, but they are still having modified school attendance or modified school schedules, they should not be progressing into step 4. Next slide, please. So the other really important part about concussion management is trying to prevent injuries in the first place. So it's far easier to prevent an injury than to manage it after the fact. And there's a lot of evidence that has come out recently that indicate there are a number of prevention strategies that have been successful in reducing the incidence of concussions. So there's evidence that show that mouth guards in youth hockey has decreased the incidence of concussion by 28%. There's evidence in that policy disallowing body checking in youth ice hockey has decreased the incidence of concussion by 58%. And there's evidence that limiting contact practice in American football has decreased concussion incidence in that sport by 64%. There's also evidence that neuromuscular training warm-ups in rugby has decreased concussion incidence by up to 60%. So we know that protective equipment and policies decreasing body contact have been instrumental in helping to decrease the concussion incidence. We also know that the establishment of concussion management protocols in school settings and sports organizations have also reduced particularly recurrent injuries, but have ensured that athletes get better management in the school environment as well as in the sporting environment that have helped improve outcomes. As Jen mentioned in her talk, the culture of the team is very important. And as the coach, you set the culture. So setting a culture of fair play and good sportsmanship within your team is really important, because that can help decrease contact and injury risk potential. And it's also important that as part of the culture that you are respectful of concussion and that you instill that respect within your team. Next slide, please. So as a coach, as Jen mentioned, you are an advocate for your athletes. And part of your role is making sure that you as a coach are knowledgeable about concussions and make use of available resources to educate yourself, but also to educate your team, your athletes, and your parents about concussion, so that everyone knows about how to recognize a concussion, so that athletes who are injured can be removed from play, and being knowledgeable about the return to sport protocol so that athletes are returned to sport in a safe way to help reduce recurrent injuries and prevent other concussions. So as a coach, you are really a partner in the health and safety of your athletes, and being knowledgeable about concussion and making sure that your team is knowledgeable about concussion can help ensure that concussions hopefully decrease in incidence, and that when they occur, they are managed appropriately so that athletes are kept safe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Purcell. I'm seeing lots of comments thanking you for providing this information, and I think providing some really practical info that people feel that they can implement. Also seeing lots of thanks for Jen and her story. And I think one of the themes we're hearing through this that both you and Jen emphasize is the importance of the community and the circle of care around athletes and participants. And that we all have a potential role to play and how important that is. And it really is, to use a sports cliche, a team effort. But that, that's such a common theme. Before we get to the Q&A portion, seeing tons pour in, we wanted to highlight some key resources as a reminder to support you in your work to help implement requirements under Rowan's Law. So on coachesontario.ca, you will find the Coaches Concussion Toolkit available. That's to help you specifically in your role as a coach to implement Rowan's Law and help support concussion safety. The Government of Ontario provides all sorts of information about Rowan's Law, including the government concussion awareness resources, protocol templates, code of conduct, all that good stuff at ontario.ca/concussions. You can also find the full legislation and regulations for Rowan's Law on Ontario eLaw online. And finally, I think we're really excited to share that, as we're talking about updated information, the Coaching Association of Canada has released their updated version of NCCP, Making Headway in Sport Concussion e-learning, which is freely available on the locker. And you can take that whether you're a coach or not. It's free for everyone. A really great tool that focuses on practical implementation. Dr. Purcell was involved in supporting those updates. I know I was involved in a number of organizations. So this really is a collective effort to share consistent information for you in all sorts of different ways. The newest addition to the CAO Concussion Toolkit for coaches is an updated version of CAO's resource for you as the designated person. And so this is an interactive resource. A previous version was available. This now reflects the newer information, including the newer steps for return to sport, the new timing around medical clearance that Dr. Purcell shared. And so this is a great, quick, interactive resource you can use to help support you through that return to sport. And one of the nice things is it focuses on some of the challenges you're going to face along the way and how to address those. So some really great practical information, and it's currently available in English with the French version to come shortly. So let's move over to your questions. There are a lot of them. And so we're going to get through as many as we can. We have about 15-20 minutes here to wrap up. And then I believe that anything we don't get to will still be captured in a Q&A resource that will be available on the coachesontario.ca website. So no matter what, an answer will come through whether we get to it in this session or not. I wanted to quickly address a question that was directed to Parachute about whether Parachute's website has been updated and whether there's information available on the changes. Yes, parachute.ca/concussions and the Parachute Guideline have all been updated. So all of our concussion guides for various audiences, return to sport, return to work, protocol templates for sport organizations, letter templates, all of that is updated in both official languages. We do have a document that describes the changes as well as a guide for updating your concussion protocol. So I can share that with CAO and we can have that information sent out to all participants who registered for the session to help you. All right, Dr. Purcell, lots of questions for you. So the very first one that came through, and I think it was prompted by Jen's mention of having a brain scan. So this question is about having brain scans available. How impactful would having an immediate brain scan available at events, tournaments, games, or at clinics? How impactful would that be to have to quickly assess? And so let's start with that.
So concussions are what we call a functional brain injury. So they affect the way the brain works. They don't cause a structural injury. So CT scans and MRIs look for structural injury. And so in a concussion setting, a CT scan and an MRI will be negative because there's no structural injury. So having those readily available on the sideline is not going to be helpful to rule out concussion. So unfortunately, right now, that's part of the difficulty with concussion. There's no specific diagnostic test that says, yes, you do, or no, you don't have a concussion. There's still a lot of research being done for various different methods, but there's been no definitive diagnostic test that's been developed to date that is readily available to diagnose concussion.
Thanks, Dr. Purcell. And as you said, we know this is such a hot area of research. Lots of people are looking at diagnosis and biomarkers and all of this, but nothing's quite there yet that we can implement kind of in the real world, so to speak. But
Exactly.
it's one of the biggest questions being looked into. Okay, there's another question related to how hard a hit needs to be to cause damage, and whether there is benefit to asking an athlete about kind of the force of the blow that they received.
So to my knowledge, and I'm not primarily a researcher, so I may not be up to date on this, but there is no sort of threshold of force that can cause a concussion, and everyone is individual. So the amount of force that may cause a concussion in one person may not cause a concussion in another person. So understanding how forceful the hit was is not very helpful. What's important is that there was a hit, and does the athlete have any symptoms associated with that? That's what you need to determine. It's not the actual force of the hit. So I hope that answers the question.
These are such challenges with the individuality, the nuances of this injury, which makes it tough to give really simple answers. But that's why it's so important that we keep learning about this and have some tools to help us, like the concussion recognition tool. Is there value in asking the athlete about how hard the force was? Maybe not in a direct translation, but could that information be beneficial in sharing with their healthcare provider a little bit of context on what happened?
I would always ask the athlete what happened. So where did you get hit? Where was the impact? When you fell, how did you fall? Like what body part hit the surface? All of that can be helpful. But the more important thing is, how is the athlete feeling after the hit? So if they're having any symptoms of concussion, even if they're just feeling a bit slowed down, the concern is that there may be a concussion, and you should err on the side of caution and assume there is one until a medical professional rules it out.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. This question was directed to Jen, who I think has stepped away, but we're happy to address it here. The question is whether rugby organizations require helmets or protective equipment. And if not, what will it take to introduce endorsed measures to mitigate severe head injuries? Dr. Purcell, I know as part of the concussion consensus, there was a systematic review on prevention. Are you able to share a little bit about that in relation to helmets and protective equipment?
So there's been a lot of research in terms of like protective headwear, including helmets. There's protective headwear that's being tried in soccer. To date, the evidence is not in favor of helmets or protective headgear being able to reduce the incidence of concussion. There's still a lot of research going on, but right now there is no evidence, no definitive evidence that headgear can help prevent a concussion.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's sometimes that seems like it would be the obvious answer, but it's really important that we look at how concussions are happening and what are some of the proven measures to prevent them. In the new edition of the Canadian Guideline on Concussion in Sport, we do provide some guiding questions and considerations for sport organizations looking at concussion prevention. And talking about what the latest consensus statement says about some of the things that have been proven effective. So really encourage organizations to check that out. Okay, we're getting through. Let's see what's next. Okay, what can we do or say when a family is hesitant to get their child diagnosed with a concussion? And what can we do when parents are not okay with waiting for their child to be seen by a medical professional? This is coming from someone who is in a small town swim club and sometimes has lengthy wait times for medical professionals.
Yeah, so when you have parents who are reluctant to have their child assessed for concussion, just go back to what you know about concussion. So, and trying to educate them as to why it's important that they get medical advice and get proper medical advice. So, often if you bring up the story of Rowan Stringer, that can make it a little bit more impactful for the parents. So there's a real person with a real story of a bad outcome for someone who did not get assessed after a concussion. Just emphasizing how important it is to make sure that if there is a concussion there, that it's properly assessed and managed so that the child can go back safely to sport. And if you need to, emphasize the catastrophic possibilities of not being properly assessed. For people who have difficult access to medical services, that can be really challenging. We know in a lot of regions, they may not have physicians who are knowledgeable in concussion. Nurse practitioners may be able to help in some settings, but it really depends on how knowledgeable the medical professional is that you are accessing. If you can't find a doctor or a nurse practitioner, physiotherapists are very knowledgeable in concussion and may be able to give some advice and may be able to direct you to medical care that is knowledgeable about concussion. So that's always a route that you can take. And for parents who are pushing back about keeping their kids out of sport, just come back to how important it is that they are safe in going back and the dangers of going back too soon. And if you have access to medical care, as a coach, your trump card can be you need medical clearance to come back. So if that's a policy that you put in place, then you can always say, our policy is you need to have medical clearance. And so you have to do that in order to come back to play. I know it's easier said than done sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's important that people have kind of some of these tools and key messages in their toolbox when we're facing these, right? We can't pretend these challenges don't exist. You know, if you are in Ontario, it is the law. It is Rowan's law. So policy backed by more policy. You know, we know it's the right thing to do, but sometimes in those challenging situations, you might have to lean into the fact that in some places you are absolutely required to do it as well.
Yeah. And in addition to Rowan's law in Ontario, the Ministry of Education implemented a mandate in 2015 that all school boards across the province have concussion policies in place. And so for schools, they have a protocol that they need to follow for kids to go back to sports, school-based sports. So as a coach in a school setting, you can always go back on that policy as well. Our policy requires medical clearance for your son or daughter to go back. So you need to get that before going back to play.
Yeah, absolutely. Is it true that once you have sustained a concussion, you are more prone to sustaining one again in the future?
Yes. So what we know about concussion is that once you've had one, you're more likely to, or you're more susceptible to concussion going forward. The problem is that there are so many factors that impact risk. So for instance, the type of sport that you play, can increase or decrease your risk. So we know that contact and collision sports have a higher risk of injury than non-contact sports like swimming and tennis. The level of competition that you play at also can increase your risk. So the higher competitive levels typically are at higher risk because they're playing faster, harder. There's usually more on the line, so there's more aggression in the play. Position can also impact concussion risk. So if you are in a team sport where you are a forward in the play more often, your risk is higher than if you're a goalie where you're only in play at certain times of the game. So there are lots of different factors that can impact concussion risk, but we know that once you've had a concussion, your risk doesn't go back to your baseline. It's always a bit higher.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of the word baseline, how beneficial is baseline testing?
So baseline testing, it's only captures the moment in time. Baseline testing can be affected by a number of different things. How well you slept the night before, if you had a fight with your friend before going in, if you have a concurrent illness. So there are many things that can impact your baseline. The other important thing to keep in mind, particularly with kids and teenagers, their cognitive development during those years is quite profound. So a baseline in September may not be their true baseline in February. So if you are using the baseline from September and you look at them and say, oh, they're great, it doesn't reflect where their cognitive development is at that time. So you may miss injuries because you're going on a false baseline. So the current recommendations are that baseline testing is not mandatory. It is not needed to successfully manage concussion. And a lot of concussions are managed without a baseline appropriately. So baseline testing, the other thing to keep in mind with baseline testing is it's expensive and it has to be done appropriately. So a number of people do a baseline test where their brother actually sits and does it for them. So the circumstances of the baseline testing have to be rigorous. And in a lot of cases, they are not. So the overwhelming recommendation at this point is that baseline testing is not mandatory and is not necessary for the vast majority of athletes.
Thank you. I think that's very clear. A couple questions related to women and girls in sport and concussion. Do you have any statistics or information on concussions in fast-growing female-led sports? An example is cheerleading.
So I don't have any statistics. The problem in Canada is it's very hard to get sport-specific statistics for Canadian athletes. A lot of the injury surveillance systems that are well developed are from the States, and so their population is much different than Canada. We do know that certain female sports do have a high risk of concussion. So ringette is one of the highest risk sports. We also know that in sports that are played with both genders, women tend to have a higher risk of concussion in same sports as men. Part of that may be that females are more ready or more likely to report that they've had an injury and not hide their symptoms. But there is some evidence showing that females do get more concussions and potentially have longer recoveries than males.
Great. That actually feeds right into the next question, which was, are women or girls more at higher risk of concussion, similar to some other injuries? So you're saying, yes, there seems to be.
There is some evidence that suggests that's the case, yeah.
Okay. Excellent, thank you. For the return to sport stages, are there recommended additional steps if the athlete in question has a diagnosed neurological disorder? such as autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, or Down syndrome?
So the steps are the same. The conundrum comes into symptoms. So, for instance, someone who has ADHD, they always have difficulty with concentration and remembering. So it's trying to tease out if they have ongoing symptoms, is that their baseline based on their pre-existing condition, or is that still the effects of concussion? We also know that the return to the classroom may be more difficult for those students because of their pre-existing problems with learning. So it's not so much a change in the steps that we follow, it's just that they may need more support in certain areas because of their pre-existing condition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And it's there is a lack of research in all sorts of populations, including athletes with various disabilities and neurological disorders. I know, it's an area that's growing. And I also know that kind of on the ground in Canada, there is work happening. Special Olympics Canada, Special Olympics Ontario are quite involved and lots of work considering their athletes specifically. So there's lots of grassroots work happening as well. Doesn't get into necessarily the clinical side too much, but there's lots of considerations just when we're talking about recognize and remove. How do we communicate? How do we talk about symptoms? All of that stuff.
Yeah. So as part of the 6th International Consensus Conference, it was recognized that Paralympic athletes are a different population, and a lot of the protocols that we have may not necessarily apply to them. So for a wheelchair athlete, their return to sport is going to be very different from an able-bodied athlete. So in the Paralympic world, they have developed their own guidelines based on the consensus document, but adapted for para-athletes. And within para-athletes, there are multiple different conditions like problems with vision, problems with hearing, very different athletes. So the guidelines have been adapted to all of those settings by the Paralympic organization. And as you mentioned, Stephanie, other groups like Special Olympics are adapting the guidelines to fit their populations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really, really important work. There was a question about, or a comment that they're hearing about officials in soccer using blue cards to send off athletes based on possible concussion, asking whether other sports are doing this. I'm aware of the blue card program being used in rugby. So this was piloted first in Ontario, and that program, I think they're looking ultimately to expand it. So that's where it's using the carding system, a blue card from the official indicates a suspected concussion and automatically
be a purple card.
Puts in into the protocol. I haven't heard about this. I haven't heard about this being implemented elsewhere in Canada. Have you heard about any others taking this? Yeah.
I haven't heard anything about it.
Okay. Yeah. Me neither. But I know that prevention is a hot topic, and it just goes to show that each sport has potentially some unique ways of going about it. Not necessarily the same in every context. There was a question I'd like to get to because I think it's a good clarification, and maybe this will be the last one that we can get to for now. It says that for return to sport stages, we're talking about 24 hours per stage and physician assessment. Yeah, so maybe we can clarify, the stages, and also that physician assessment, the role of that versus, it's not necessarily an assessment after every stage. Maybe we can clarify a little bit about progress through that and what the role of health professionals is.
So it depends a little bit, depending on the healthcare practitioner that you see. My practice is that I see an injured athlete on a weekly basis from the initial appointment until they're about a month or 6 weeks out from injury. The reason for that is I want to give ongoing guidance about how to manage school and how to manage activity. So depending on where they are, every time I see them, I can provide ongoing advice about what they should be doing. In terms of the return to sport protocol, I review that with them on the first visit. So if they are more than a couple of days from the time of injury, I make sure that they are doing some activity. So if they've been at step 1, I will encourage them to start step 2, which is light aerobic non-impact activity like walking, stationary bike, swimming, elliptical, yoga, as long as they avoid head down positions, that kind of activity. And I encourage them to do it for 20 minutes or so a day, just to get their heart rate up and get them moving a little bit and see how they feel with that. And then I will give them advice about how to move from step 3 to from step 2 to step 3, which is sport specific activity, and make it very clear that they should not move beyond that until they're symptom free and they've been medically cleared. So steps 1 through 3, they don't necessarily need a note to do that. They just need to be aware that they need to take a minimum of 24 hours between each step, and they need to use the symptom exacerbation guidelines. So no more than 1 or 2 points out of 10 increase. And if they do have exacerbation of their symptoms, that the symptoms are returning to baseline within an hour of stopping activity. Steps 4 through 6, at that point, they need medical clearance. So they should be obtaining a note from their healthcare practitioner that they can take to school, that they can take to the coach, that says they are symptom-free and they can progress through the next steps. So what I often do is I give a form with the steps on it, and I will give dates when they can start doing those steps. And I give very clear advice to the athlete that it has to be a minimum of 24 hours in between, and that you can't progress if you have symptoms. If you have symptoms, you need to come back and see me. You do not go on before you don't go on to the next steps. So that letter can be provided to the school and to coaches so that they know exactly when they can be progressing to the next step and when they should be seeking advice from me.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah. So in terms of policy, typically it's medical assessment and medical clearance are the 2 required points in terms of policy, but there's, likely benefit depending on the individual to working with a health professional along the way in terms of a clinical sense.
Yes.
Thank you everyone so much. Thank you, Dr. Purcell. You answered such a wide variety of questions. There are more. Dr. Purcell and I will work with CAO to write up these answers and make sure that everyone gets their questions addressed. A huge thank you again to CAO. Thank you for including Parachute as a partner and Ophea as well. And thank you to the Government of Ontario for making this event and the updated resources possible. Thank you, everyone, and take care.
Bye.